partisan divide in the U.S. seems unbridgeable at times, and many issues in higher education are deeply dividing politicians. But with the 2024 election just days away, there's a remarkable amount of alignment around the importance of workforce development and training and how to strengthen it. Hello, and welcome to a new episode of The Key, Inside Higher Ed's news and analysis podcast. I'm Doug Letterman, co-founder of Inside Higher Ed and your host. Thanks for listening today. On the campaign trail last month, Vice President Kamala Harris said the following: "For far too long, our nation has encouraged only one path to success, a four-year college degree. Our nation needs to recognize the value of other paths, additional paths, such as apprenticeships and technical programs." Those words could have come out of the mouth of her Republican opponent, former President Donald Trump, whose platform for the presidency calls for creating, quote, additional drastically more affordable alternatives to a traditional four-year college degree. Governors of both parties have in recent years signed executive orders eliminating bachelor's degree requirements for government jobs in their states, and we've seen bipartisan support for making federal Pell Grants available for various short-term training programs, for example. Today's episode explores this phenomenon and its implications with two thoughtful and knowledgeable guests. Amanda Winters is Program Director for Postsecondary Education at the National Governors Association, and Michelle Van Noy is Director of the Education and Employment Research Center at Rutgers University's School of Management and Labor Relations. In the conversation that follows, they discuss how this alignment around workforce training is affecting policy developments at the state and federal levels, and how November's election might change what happens in the next few years, if at all. Before we get to Amanda and Michelle, here's a word from the Gates Foundation, which is sponsoring this episode of The Key.
This episode of The Key is brought to you by the Gates Foundation, working to ensure that race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status are no longer predictors of educational success. Learn more about the Foundation's work to improve digital teaching and learning, advance institutional transformation, and more at usprogram.gatesfoundation.org.
Now on to today's episode. Amanda and Michelle, welcome to The Key, and thanks for being here.
Thanks. Excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So at a time where it seems like politicians can't agree on much of anything these days, workforce training seems to be an area of relative bipartisanship among policymakers. Is that a reality? How much alignment is there on issues of workforce preparation? And if it's significant, why is that so? Why do we see that kind of alignment?
We do have a lot of alignment on the issue of workforce. There is kind of become this shared recognition of the importance of middle skill jobs in particular. So I think we see a lot of focus in that area. And, there's just a lot of alignment about the importance of the workforce in general for promoting economic development, for promoting the health of the economy. And so I think we are sort of seeing this sort of shared idea that these investments are super important for the overall health of the country. And so it is an interesting area of alignment. I mean, we can probably talk more later about differences that are there, but in terms of a shared value, it is one that does persist.
As Michelle said, there's a bunch of different spaces within the workforce conversation where we're seeing a lot of movement. So it does feel like broadly the workforce or talent and industry aligned conversations are moving forward, pretty well. And we have some spaces where there's some exciting things happening. And I will say a lot of the movement we see, no big surprise from NGA's perspective, is in the states. And some exciting innovations happening and some momentum there that I think can be done in concert with some federal moves, but also independently really seeing some governors take the lead on some innovation around workforce and talent strategies.
Would you mind giving us a few examples of the things that have you kind of most jazzed, that are most striking maybe to you?
When I'm referring to workforce, I'm really thinking sort of a small W workforce, not necessarily just the big W WIOA workforce conversation. A few trend areas that I think we're going to be able to dig into in our conversation is around the credential space and seeing several states really dig in and think about, certainly Texas and Connecticut. Some states are thinking deeply about how to assess and track some of the credential programs and how to better invest. The Virginia Fast Forward program tying workforce credentials to data collection, and there's a real regionality to that conversation. But also broadly, the skills-based conversation I think that's happening across the nation, which I've been to federal committee conversations, and they've actually said these are the most bipartisan conversations that we've had this term, because there's a lot of shared interest in getting more people access to economic mobility pathways and how skills can get us there. I don't think we fully know how the skills will get us there yet, but I think there's really a lot of energy at the federal and state level around thinking about skills pathways within our education and workforce space.
We're seeing also a shift, I think, in how policymakers are thinking about economic development. So I think that increasingly we see in lots of parts of the country that are looking to grow their economies are looking to growing the workforce. So for example, we're doing some research on economic development and community colleges and technician programs. And we're seeing, obviously, in places like Ohio and Arizona, where you've got big companies coming in, Intel and others that are really need the workforce. And I think that's where everybody comes together, because you've got really big employers that need workforce, and it's really crucial for the health of the economy. But it's a broad shift that's happening, I think, in the field of economic development to recognize the importance of workforce and how crucial that is. So I do think that's a very broad shift that's happening in that field that definitely sort of trickles into this policy space.
How does that shift toward a focus on workforce manifest itself?
Well, I think there was a lot of incentives that local areas would provide to employers to move in here. We're going to give you X number of dollars if you come here. And now they might still be doing that, but they're also saying, or in addition to, they're saying, hey, we also have, a great workforce. We've got, we have upskill. We have people that we can upskill. We've got, an educated and skilled workforce.
A lot of this for us, when we're talking to governors' offices, is tied to some of the money that's coming down from the feds around infrastructure and chips investments. Those are monies flowing through very different funding streams than we've seen in the past for workforce investment. We're not seeing it come from Department of Labor or Department of Education, who are the ones who usually are in control of some of these funds that are meant to create and expand credentialing programs or degree opportunities. We're seeing them flow through departments of energy and departments of transportation. And so there's really sort of a shift to how does this more directly tie to skills needs. In what Michelle was saying about economic development, we've seen a lot of these conversations in a sector focus. Mm-hmm. Like the state of Georgia, Governor Kemp was saying we want Georgia to be the electric vehicle capital. And that means a lot of things to that state. It means not only manufacturing of the vehicles, but it means battery manufacturing. It means supplies and training for technicians. So it means a lot of different things, and it means a lot of different credential and workforce investments that will come from a strategy of that type. So we're sort of seeing the flows tied to some of these federal dollars, but really focused on sectors and the attracting of and creation of whole hubs.
What are the implications of the fact that the money is coming from these other agencies that haven't historically been at the center of the workforce training conversation?
These are new relationships that are being built. And we're seeing some exciting things come out of that, but there are growing pains, I think, in states as they're thinking about who needs to be at the table. And education and workforce, frankly, have in the past sort of dominated the conversation around credentialing and skill preparation. Now I think industry and industry needs are a bit more centered, at least in these sector-specific conversations, because of where the money is flowing. So I think it's just more infused with industry needs, which can be great, but also complicate the conversation around the building and deployment of credentials.
Can you give us a sense of these growing pains?
The example I'll give is, on our electric vehicle side, there's some frameworks that are coming out for, some of the technician spaces, and we're seeing a variety of quality because of really quick rollout of credential programs in response to what is believed to be the industry need. So there's still some disconnects in setting those up, and then some real variability in the quality of what gets rolled out and whether or not that's going to be seen as a high quality training program to an employer if it's not really done with intentionality and it's not really, has quality built into it. So we're seeing some of those growing pains too, where there's a knee-jerk reaction to create something in response to industry needs without sort of the bigger conversation around, mobility pathways and quality.
Right. And as Michelle can, I'm sure, attest, that's a not uncommon phenomenon in the creation of new credentials historically in our post-secondary education and training ecosystem. But Michelle, assume you're paying very close attention to that set of issues around quality of credentials as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge area. We have such a large proliferation of credentials right now, and everyone's trying to make sense of what they are and what they mean and there is this sort of shared problem that we all have, which is how do we create a skilled and qualified workforce to meet the needs of industry and of economies. But we've got all this activity going on that we're trying to make sense of. So collectively trying to figure out what is good and where do we have data? We don't have data on much of this. And as much as we're talking about different funding streams coming down to support this, we're also talking about a humongous range of different providers in this space now that are offering different kinds of credentials. And some of them we have data and some of them we don't. And there's not sort of set quality assurance systems in place. So there's a lot going on in this area that's still trying to settle and we have a lot to navigate here. So it's very much a shared problem, I think, that everybody's engaged in trying to solve.
How confident can we be that this alignment is necessarily going to result in real progress? I mean, in other words, you both described some things that are happening, but this is such a big, complex ecosystem, and a lot of things have to be sort of heading in the same direction to get really significant movement. And I'm curious, how significant is this alignment, and does it ensure that this kind of complex, messy ecosystem gets sort of figured out faster? When
you work in the education policy space, and Doug, I know you've been following these trends for years, you can sort of see when there's a momentum build up to where something's going to happen. And we're really seeing that now, I think, in the non-degree credential as well as the skills broadly space. There's a lot of momentum. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's doing it. So yeah, I think we expect to see a lot of stuff happen in states. There's a few areas of alignment of policy that we're seeing come out with some state efforts. First of all, data expansion is huge. And I know there's been federal conversations about getting clearer data and building more connected systems, which we'll see what actually ends up happening at the federal legislation level. But certainly in states, we've seen a lot of energy around better connecting data systems and being inclusive of more pathways within that. So not just non-degree credentials, but also things like apprenticeships. And then also mapping over to, when we're talking about the workforce, many of the things that are goals for states when we have such a tight labor market is getting access for new populations who have been in the past disconnected from some of these good paying jobs and these good pathways. So that necessitates a conversation around things like benefits cliffs and, childcare. And one of the biggest workforce conversations we have is childcare. So, these interconnections of policy, I think, are happening in states. I'm not saying everybody solved it, but the connections are being made in a way that I think is really important, because it can't just be credentialing programs. It has to be, access and affordability and completion and then outcomes if we're talking about all of these things. But then also we're balancing it with a national conversation about the ROI of college. And I don't think we can separate those two things as we're talking about, advancing policy conversations here, that's sort of a critical intersection for any of these things to move forward.
I'm glad you raised the topic of the intersection between the workforce conversation and the discussions about, quote, higher ed, about which we're continuing to see pretty significant division. it makes sense to me in certain ways that there is greater alignment around workforce issues than about other aspects of post-secondary education, given the tendency to focus in those latter discussions on culture war issues and other things like that. But what are the limits of the alignment around workforce, and what are the pitfalls of sort of separating workforce training from other higher ed and post-secondary education issues?
There's a lot of opportunities, but also pitfalls that can come from the advancing of the conversation around, credentials alongside like a state's post-secondary attainment goals. When I first started at NGA, it was the higher ed portfolio that I started or restarted. And I actually changed it to post-secondary because I had a governor's advisor way back then who said, oh, we don't do higher ed because we work mostly with community colleges. And so there was this, and I was like, oh, I hate to tell you this, but rather than, I was like, I'm just going to expand my language. So it's inclusive of community colleges, because I do think that we are seeing some states who are really trying to emphasize both their post-secondary attainment as well as, some of these additional pathways. But there are some states that trend towards the shorter term as sort of the investment in the space they want to live in. First of all, political lifetimes are shorter. And so when you get the shorter term credentials, you can see more results more quickly as you move people in and through credentialing programs. But also there is the danger of saying, well, the degrees are for some people who have traditionally gotten access to those. And then all the others go in this space. So the othering of the, credentials and sort of different pathways space is a pitfall that we want to make sure as governors are thinking about their workforce that they don't inadvertently fall into with some of their policies, making this say this path for thee, but not for me or my children. And I think it's a lot of the same conversations that have been mirrored in the CTE space in the past, like, oh, some kids, do it, not saying they don't, but should be in CTE. And then oh, this person, well, college isn't for them. So those kinds of things that can be sort of those communication or those articulation pitfalls as we're thinking holistically about talent development, which is inclusive of shorter term credentials, different types of pathways, all the way up to PhDs. All of them are needed across many of our critical areas, but just thinking about how we strategize about those, I don't know that we found sort of the right ways yet in some state policy conversations to balance those things. So what you're talking about, I don't know that we found really what are the boundaries. They differ from state to state and also like policy area to policy area under this sort of broad heading of workforce.
I guess one of the things this conversation makes me think of is that it's almost like a little bit of a pendulum swing in alignment in terms of sort of general thinking about the role of education. And I'm thinking in the 90s, there was the school to work movement and everyone was thinking about how to align with and make that transition to work help for people. And then we kind of moved from that into this college for all idea and really trying to open up and expand access, which was a really important goal. But I do think that, as that goal has gotten pushed and prioritized in sort of policy discussions, I think now we're seeing a little bit of the counter reaction to that, which is to say, yeah, that's college is important. It's a thing, but there's all this other stuff that we can't neglect in that as well. And so I think there's a little bit of the sort of like trying to rebalance and realign, like how do we imagine all of these things sort of as important parts of the policy environment and really as important parts if we go back to this idea of the workforce being important for economic success, all of these things are important for economic success in any given area. So how do we balance these things out? And I think that's what states and others are trying to figure out is like, how do we prioritize our investments, I suppose, if that's the end goal in mind. But also, I'm just trying to think about that's also in the context of this kind of like realignment now with the sort of idea of college being the end all be all for everybody, to recognize that there are other pathways that people want to take and that are also really valuable for the economy, but also keeping things open, as Amanda said, to make sure that the access for all pathways are equitable for people to make good decisions for themselves and what they want to do.
We've touched on a lot of issues so far, and one of the things I always struggle with in discussions about the workforce space is how to make sense of, bring order to the enormous array of credentials and skills and potential jobs and training programs and what employers are doing and states are doing and the feds are doing. Ideally, we'd have more linkages and connections so that people don't get credentials that lead to dead ends on any kind of regular basis. And I guess, how do you bring sense and order to this unbelievably complex question of how we get people from where they are to where employers and society and the people themselves need and want them to be? Would it make sense to have a more unified national, but definitely not federal kind of workforce system of some kind? Is that possible? Is it desirable?
I think alignment is incredibly important, and especially even just thinking in a singular state, alignment of understanding of credentials of quality that exist in their systems across K-12, all the postsecondary institutions, eligible training provider lists, having a shared conversation there. And I will say, again, my plug for data, the data collection to actually prove any of this out. And I also think when you were talking, Doug, it was reminding me that, on the education and workforce side, we like to lay out stackable pathways in nice, neat little lines and be like, this is what we created for you. Now go and do it. But then if we actually have moments where we map students' pathways through their workforce or education workforce experience, it's hardly ever along the paths that we set out for them. They move around. It's much more squiggly line than straight line. And so I think that's another element of this is, we have a tendency to lay things out how we want them to happen and not really map the realities of how people are making decisions about, the credential programs that they're getting into or where they go next. Or like where they're getting information. Where it's like, we're going to put a bunch of advisors out there and we're going to lay out this career pathway map and then go and do. And then we make a lot of assumptions rather than really having clear data about what's happening. And I think we can, if we have those alignments, at least internally to a state as a starting point, which I think some states are trying to dig into right now. And then nationally, just have a conversation about the key elements of quality across states. I don't think we need to have the same outlook all the time. We can have the Ohio framework and we can have the Maryland framework. So we can have all of these things developing. But if we have some shared understandings about, the foundational elements of quality and impact and ROI and, what kind of metrics we're collecting and where this, data lives and how to talk across states about some of these key issues. I think that's where you'll start to see like real acceleration of the national conversation when you can say, okay, we're all trying this stuff. Now here are these connection points. And I think we're pretty close, I think, to being able to talk about that across states.
Michelle?
I agree with Amanda. I think there's a lot going on in states. And I think there's an appetite for trying to understand and share lessons around what's happening, which I think is an opportunity for coordination. It's not an opportunity. It's not a moment to say everybody has to do it exactly the same way. But since everyone's kind of working on trying to create these systems for data and for quality, why not share and look for commonalities? It's sort of everyone can learn from each other and certainly having a little bit more of a systematic approach where it makes sense and where it's possible is only going to benefit everybody. The one thing that I do see, I think that is necessary and possibly maybe bipartisan is just investment in these systems, because this is complicated. There's hundreds of thousands of credentials and different parts of the states doing these things and different providers getting into the game. It's a complex problem for states to figure out, for the federal government, for anybody to figure out. And so if there's any one place to invest in, it is, I think, in the data infrastructure and the quality assurance infrastructure, just to get a handle on these complicated systems and what needs to be brought together, because it is a complicated project. There's a lot of work. As Amanda said, it's kind of a moment right now that a lot of this stuff is happening, and to the extent we can be intentional about how we do this, hopefully there'll be better systems on the other side to help workers get the kinds of skills they need, and economies have the skills, among their workforce. So it's a time.
When you talked about quality assurance, do we know yet sort of what quality assurance looks like or is likely to look like in this workforce space? I mean, especially as you move out of degrees and credit, you sort of move away, at least from the traditional accreditors to some extent. Who is responsible for quality assurance in this realm?
So the states play a huge role here. Right. In some states, you have really robust oversight of, especially outside of our traditional public education providers. You have some really great work going on in the oversight of some of the credentials that live outside that space. And so I think leveraging state quality assurance structures is going to be key. And that also is not just about the credential, but also the credential provider. So especially sitting outside of community colleges or universities within states, like when I worked in Illinois, there's 200 plus training providers that are also overseen by the state agency who oversees higher education that don't offer degrees. Many of them are not Title IV eligible. But they leverage things like WIOA dollars or veterans training dollars. And so there's a real consumer protection need there. So I think an important thing to think about too with quality assurance is, especially when you think about the difference between state quality assurance and then accreditation. So state quality assurance is a floor. They're like, don't steal from people. It's very much a don't be below this line, or we're going to have to do something. But it is not the same as accreditation in the sense that it's not trying to make you the best you can be. It's trying to keep you from being the worst that you can be so that people do not suffer harm by coming to your institution and getting a credential. However, accreditation on the other side is, you can have industry accreditation where it's like you're mapped to a framework and, you're aligned in these ways that we've talked about nationally across the sector. I think that will play a pretty big role in the non-degree credential or the workforce aligned training space. Those types of bodies, like even just this morning, I was talking to a group called WorkCred that works across credentialing bodies. And so I think those types of voices are going to be incredibly important in this space. More traditional accreditors like HLC, I know, is thinking deeply about how they fit into the conversation around accreditation of shorter term credentials. And so that type of accreditation is really like, continuous improvement. How do you get better? How are your faculty trained? How are they supported in doing these things? So it's kind of the opposite end of the quality conversation. It's not the floor, but it's like, how do we continue growing? So I think all of these pieces have a role. You need to have really strong floor put in place for consumer protection, but then you need elements that take you to getting better and better and hopefully continuously improve upon the things that you're putting in place. So for me, when I'm thinking about quality assurance, I'm thinking of several of those pieces together to, protect the learner or worker who's moving through these pathways, but then also to get better and to improve our processes year over year, which is not something that sits necessarily with a state oversight system.
This episode of The Key is brought to you by the Gates Foundation, working to ensure that race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status are no longer predictors of educational success. Learn more about the Foundation's work to improve digital teaching and learning, advance institutional transformation, and more at usprogram.gatesfoundation.org.
I'm speaking today with Amanda Winters of the National Governors Association and Rutgers University's Michelle Van Noy. Here's the rest of our conversation. How possible is it that the election sort of scrambles this landscape we've been talking about, or is the alignment that we've been talking about strong enough that it's unlikely to sort of radically shake up the picture?
Just picking up on what Amanda was saying about the sort of role for quality assurance, and I think there's a lot of entities that are out there doing this work, and I think that that's okay because there's a lot of different kinds of credentials we're talking about here. So we've got industry certifications, we've got certificates that are awarded by academic institutions, that are awarded by other kinds of providers, we've got badges, we've got apprenticeships. And each of those kinds of credentials has their own logic in a way and has their own sort of emergent quality systems that make sense given the nature of their credential. And different providers. So I think there is some logic to it, but I think the point, like Amanda's making, is that there needs to be something that, what it is, whether it's, setting the bar or, setting aspirations, there should be something. And so, states are definitely a locus of where a lot of that activity is happening. And to the extent that I think the election is going to change that or transform that, I have to say that my gut instinct is that I think there's a lot of momentum underway. And I think it could be shifted in one direction or the other, but I feel like there's a lot of actors that have realized the importance of this issue and of tackling it. And there's a lot of momentum from a lot of different sides that my sense is it's going to keep on moving. It might move slightly differently, but I think that the train is out and it's going to keep moving out of that station. There's a lot going on here, and a lot of conversations that are happening that will continue to happen.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, do you agree with that?
Yeah, all the things we talked about just in this short conversation are things that we're seeing move across red and blue states, and very blue and very red states. I don't see it as being something a train that's going to stop anytime soon. And certainly just hearing from the candidates at the federal level, I don't see any indication that there's really a lot of difference, actually, when it comes to some of these issues. You see Kamala Harris talking about some very similar things to what was enacted by executive order under the Trump administration when it talks around skills and pathways. So really, I think this is a space that is exciting to engage in because there's cool ideas and great stuff coming from very different ends of a political spectrum, but really meeting a lot of the same goals. We have a really tight labor market. We have some quickly expanding sectors of industry that have high need for skilled workers. There's a desire to get people into better economic mobility pathways for their family, to increase buying houses and starting businesses, and all of those things are important to both sides of the aisle. So I really think that when we get at the core of some of these issues, I don't see it really deviating much from the excitement and the energy that we have now, no matter what happens at the state or federal level when it comes to the elections this November.
That was Amanda Winters of the National Governors Association, joined in conversation by Rutgers' Michelle Van Noy, talking about the general political alignment we see around issues of workforce training and development. Thanks to them both for their terrific insights, and thanks again to the Gates Foundation for its support for this podcast. I had a slightly wistful feeling listening to this conversation, mostly because it doesn't seem like it should be such a shock to find a topic that politicians generally agree about. I tend to feel that a lot these days, even on some of the more contentious issues that higher ed journalists like me write about, because I tend to find that most of the time there's a big, solid group in the middle that can agree or can at least have a civil conversation and find some consensus. Yet the extremes tend to drown them out and create the impression that the problems are unsolvable, which can lead to a real sense that we're doomed. Hopefully this conversation gives you a little bit of hope as we head into an election that emphasizes difference and can feed despair. We'll get through it if we just show a little grace toward each other. That's all for this episode of The Key. I'm Doug Letterman. Have a great day.